I had an idea today for a video that I'd like to make, and I'm going to make a few more like this, which are aimed at, let's just say, homeowners who own equipment. We live in a world now where you can go on Amazon and you can click a button and something can arrive at your house. And it may or may not come with the owner's manual and you may or may not read it. But there are people who have spent a large amount of money but have a very small amount of understanding for something that they own, whether that's a chainsaw or lawnmower or even a car. And the list goes on and on. And so what I think is lacking in our world more probably than the past is that instead of knowledge and possessions growing at a similar rate, our possessions are growing and our knowledge is not. And so when you own something like a chainsaw, you had to spend money, but you should have also spent effort to gain in knowledge. And then once you have knowledge and you have the equipment, then you train your body to use the techniques that are useful for getting the job done as well as keeping you safe. So how you hold it, how you start it, how you use it. And because manufacturers want to sell you something and they don't really care if you use it well or not, there's a lot of money put into getting you to click and buy. There's not a equivalent amount of energy put into how to use well and how to maintain and how to make it last a long time. And so this is kind of along those lines. And I chose the chainsaw because that's what I have on my bench today. This video is not designed to teach you how to use a chainsaw or how to be safe with a chainsaw. That's not an area where I think I have expertise, and it's not something I want to be teaching and sharing, but I've fixed about 200 broken chainsaws in the last 5 years, and I think that makes me somewhat of an expert to at least share with what I'm going to share with you today. So these are the things that I think you should know if you're a chainsaw owner and you want to still use that chainsaw in 10 years and you want it to work reliably and you don't want it to give you trouble. So this is about the chainsaw and keeping it running, not about the chainsaw user and keeping him safe, just to be clear. Okay, so the first thing, if you own a chainsaw that you need to understand is that fuel goes in here and that fuel needs to be mixed with oil. And that's not just any oil like motor oil, that's a specific two-cycle, two-stroke mix oil. And if you don't know that, you shouldn't own a chainsaw, because if you don't put the oil in there, you will seize up the piston inside the cylinder, because this little part that goes up and down has to be lubricated. The second thing that you need to know is that in this port goes bar and chain oil. Again, not motor oil. It's a special type of oil. It's stickier. It stays on the chain and the bar, and you need that. What you also need to know is that these have been designed so that when you run out of fuel, you've also run out of oil or very close to it. And so you should plan on replacing, filling these up at the same time. The second thing you should know is that in several chainsaw owner's manuals that I've looked through, they say that your chain will need sharpening every time you go to fill these up. And what you may or may not easily understand is that it's much easier to keep something relatively sharp every once in a while than to let something go from super sharp to kind of sharp to dull to super dull and then bring it back to super sharp. It's very hard to recreate the geometry on a chainsaw chain, but it's quite a bit easier to maintain what's already there. Okay, so when you refill the gas and you refill the oil, you need to think about doing a light sharpening. And the best way to do that is to pinch this in a vise. You can also buy what's called a stump vise, which nails into a stump. So if you're out in the forest, you can have a stump vise, but you can also just kind of sit on this thing and straddle it like you love it, and you can do the chainsaw sharpening, which I'm not going to do a video on today. Okay, the next thing while we're working over in this area, that you need to know about is that the sprocket at the end here needs to be lubricated on most models, although some of them are sealed, and you'll know that it needs to be lubricated because there's a small hole right in front of my thumb. And you use either a little grease gun with a nozzle like this, or something like you'd buy at Ace Hardware, which are designed for chainsaws by Oregon, and you put that in there and you pump some grease in there. That's going to keep this working. The bar and chain oil is going to keep the rails working. The manufacturers also recommend flipping the bar over. That's why sometimes instead of seeing Husqvarna, you'll see Husqvarna, and that's because you're supposed to flip this over, primarily because the bulk of the chainsaw cutting that you do is in this area, and as you push down and you create heat, this part of the bar will start to bend over and mushroom, and this part goes unused, and so you flip it occasionally. You also get a lot of wear here at the nose, and you want to distribute that wear, because what you want is you want your whole bar to be worn out at the same time when you go to replace it. You don't really want a awful bar down here and a perfect bar up here, because you've basically thrown away 50% of the life. Okay, the next thing that you need to know if you want your saw to last is you need to understand what this thing does. And that's called the chain brake. And I'm not going to go into what it's for, because if you don't know that, you shouldn't own a chainsaw. And my job today is not to keep you safe, it's to keep your chainsaw alive. But what I want to show you is the danger in not understanding how that works. So let me do two things at once. Okay, so these are now loose. And as we, well, you know what I'll do? I'll take this off first, and I'll show you what you need to know about the chain brake, and then we'll tighten it back up and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so when the chain brake is activated, this loop of metal gets tight. And so right now this spins, and right now it doesn't. That's what the chain brake does. Now this is a clutch drum. It's very easy to disassemble on most models. You got a clip, you got a cover, and if you're not careful, you'll lose that bearing. Many manufacturers recommend removing and lubricating this at times and replacing it at times. It's really easy to get to. Anyway, now some of you may notice the discoloration of this, and that comes from heat, and that comes from people using chainsaws who don't understand what's going on here. So this is called the centrifugal clutch. And basically what happens is, if you've ever been on a merry-go-round, you know that the faster your buddy spins you, the more likely you are to slide off and out. That's because of centrifugal force. So this centrifugal clutch is held into a small circle by these springs, and as the speed of this shaft increases, the centrifugal force increases, and these three shoes are thrown out and they create a bigger circle. They push on the inside of this drum. This drum is connected to your chain, and it begins spinning. The reason engineers could have made a chainsaw without this clutch. What that would have meant is that the chain was always spinning. If the engine was on, the chain would be spinning. And so a clutch allows us to disconnect or decouple the engine from the chain. It's no different than the clutch in your manual or automatic transmission in your vehicle. And we do that so that if the engine's running, the car doesn't have to be moving. We could have basically done away with that on the car as well, but that means the second the engine starts, the vehicle moves, and that's not desirable. Now, what happens is when the engine is idling, this is spinning and this is not, so everything is fine. When you rev the engine a little bit, these come out and they try and start spinning this. But if you have this locked and you have this ring all closed up, then this will not spin. So what would you have? You would have this essentially being a stationary object, this being a spinning object, and the faster you rev, the closer these shoes get to this drum, and they begin to create tons of friction, which can warp this disc. If you look at it from this angle, it should be flat across. They can get warped. This can get so hot that it begins to deteriorate, and it can also get so hot that it begins to melt the plastic all around here. So you need to understand this mechanism. Whether you're a small engine mechanic or not, you need to understand that you have a chain brake and what it does and to what it and how it works, basically. While we're here, you also need to understand that this part of the saw gets extremely filthy because this fills up with shavings and chips, because ultimately after the chain has done its cutting. Basically, the teeth go around, they grab some wood, and they bring it back here, and the wood chips are thrown. Basically, as the chain goes around this tight bend here, it throws the chips out the discharge chute. And since trees are sappy, and since there's oil all over the chain, everything in here gets gunky and nasty, and that decreases airflow and increases friction and increases heat, and that can lead to the overheating of plastics and things like that, making your saw run hotter and hotter. Not to mention, your chain itself will be extremely hot because of the friction as it runs through the bar. So even if you don't, even if you're not cutting everything, if you just rev the engine, the sliding friction of the chain through the bar is going to create all kinds of heat. So this is just a super hot area. On more expensive saws, there will be things in here made out of metal instead of plastic. And on cheaper saws, they'll be made out of plastic, as I said. So if you do take apart the saw to lubricate this, as some manufacturers recommend, you're going to have to take this off. And if you take this off, you're going to have to put it back on. And if you don't recognize that there are notches in these to intersect with that little guy, then you're just going to throw that on there and crank it down, and you won't have an oil pump. So the very clever engineers of chainsaws have used this tiny little notch to intersect with this tiny little rod, which I hope you can see moving down at the bottom or at the top. This one has a double notch. So you have a notch here and a notch here, and you have a pin on both sides. Most steels and Husqvarnas only have one, although don't quote me on that. It's just anecdotal experience. So you need to line this notch up with that, because if it's not lined up correctly, those aren't going to be spinning, and those are what drive your oil pump. No oil pump, no oil coming out of here, which means your bar will not be lubricated. You'll ruin your chain, you'll ruin your bar all very quickly. All right, so I'm going to throw that back on. So you need to know those things. As a chainsaw owner, as a chainsaw operator, if you don't want to replace your chainsaw soon. Okay, now, next thing, you need to know which way chain goes onto the bar. If you don't know that, that's a problem. Okay, next thing, you need to know how to reattach your chain if it gets stuck in wood and you have to take your saw apart while you're out there. And what you'll find is if you took this cover off, you now won't be able to get it back on. And that's because this screw controls the position of this stud, and this stud interacts with this or that hole. That's why there's two, because you're supposed to be flipping it, by the way. And if you just pull this cover off, because it's a tapered pin, it'll help you get it off, but it'll be almost impossible to get back on. So you have to loosen this first. You have to take some of the tension off. Then, as you put this in place, you kind of give it a wiggle until you're confident that that metal pin I just showed you has made its way into the hole in the bar. Otherwise, you crush the whole assembly and things don't work properly. Okay, so the next thing you need to be able to do is you need to know how to tension your chain. You also need to know that you never tension a hot chain. So if you've been out in the woods working and this whole assembly is hot, don't tension your chain. The reason why is because everything in the world, just about, except for water, expands as it gets hot. So let's say that the length of this chain is 30 inches. If you get it hot, it goes to 31 inches or something like that. And so what happens is if you tension the chain while the whole assembly is hot and stretched and extra long, then when it shrinks and you go to start it the next day, the whole system is going to be super tight, and with that tightness comes majorly increased friction, and you destroy the saw. So you have to tension it while it's cool to the touch, okay? And the way that you do that, depending on your model, is you begin to take slack out until, I forget the word for these, to be honest, the technical term for this part of the chain that goes into the rail. Let's call them runners for today. So basically until they're there. And what I like to do is I like to take a tool and run the chain around a couple times because sometimes there's a little bit of slack that's jammed up somewhere. And then while the nuts are still loose, you lift up on the nose. Okay, this thing pivots a bit. You lift up on the nose, and with it lifted up on the nose, you then pull more tension until these runners suck in, and just basically the flats of the chain are having contact with the rail. Okay, then I normally do this real quick where I'll just do 1, 2, something like that. Then I'll lift up again, and then what you want to do is you want to pull down the chain and see if it snaps back into place. If it snaps back into place, you're good to go. If it's saggy, then you need a little bit more tension. Then once you're done, you tighten down the bar nuts. Okay. The next thing you need to know is that, thanks to the EPA, every chainsaw is going to have a spark arrestor. So this is your muffler, and right here you have this little diverter, which keeps this part of your hand a little bit cooler so that the exhaust isn't coming out here. It redirects. And underneath there is a little spark arrestor. And the purpose of a spark arrestor is to arrest sparks. They don't want the occasional spark flying out of the muffler and landing in the forest and catching something on fire. Oops, I should have pre-loosened those. Sorry guys, 1 second. Okay, the reason you need to know that that little guy is in there is not necessarily so that you can throw it away because you don't care about the environment or you don't care about starting fires, although some people do that. It's so that you can occasionally clean it because it gets carboned up and sooty. So if you take this little diverter off, you'll see the screen. And this screen is of a size to catch a spark that might be coming out. Now you'll see that you can see through this easily. But over time, they get black and sooty and they can get plugged up. And that's basically like having a potato in your tailpipe, for those of you who know that about vehicles, or a plugged up air filter. You basically just diminishing the flow through the machine. I'm not going to put that on right now just to save time, but you do put them back on. Okay, so the next thing that you need to know is how to take this top cover off. In this case, it's 2 little clips. And in other cases, it's screws and all that kind of stuff. What you need to know now is that when you take this off, you shouldn't run the machine, because this cover is not just to make things look pretty or keep your hands out of there. This cover is to seal this whole system so that air comes in through here, because there's a fan blade attached to your flywheel. You should know that too. And it pulls air through and out the machine properly. If you don't have this cover in place, it can pull the air in, but it doesn't push it around the engine like it should. And so if you run a machine without this cover, you'll cook it, you'll ruin it, you'll overheat it. All right, the next thing you need to know is that that's your air filter. And the air filter is one of the most important things on the whole machine. And because everyone's heard of air filters and they don't cost much and they don't look sophisticated, people tend to think they're not important, and they're dead wrong. Your machine runs on 15 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. So this machine actually burns air way more than it burns fuel. And that air needs to be clean, debris-free, dust-free in order for your engine to live for a long time. And unfortunately, the chainsaw works in a filthy environment. And so this area gets totally filthy. And as this gets packed up, the motor can overheat because it's air cooled and it relies on good airflow through these fins. And at some point, if these air filter material passageways get so plugged up, air will do what humans do, which is to take the path of least resistance, and it becomes easier to sneak around the air filter and get in the engine than it does to go through the air filter. And so you need to clean this. Good practice is to clean this every time you use the saw. Now, within reason, if you trim 2 little branches on a rose bush, okay, you don't need to clean it. But if you use your machine for 30 minutes, I would take this off and clean it. And I would also clean this whole area. One way you can do it is with an air compressor and some air like this. You get down in there, it works really well. Another option is to use something like a paintbrush. You flip the machine upside down, you get it wet, and you kind of, let gravity help you as you dislodge stuff. You can also just use, a screwdriver, and you can kind of scrape, although that takes a while because you're kind of only scraping in one little area. And if you're rich, you can just spray carb cleaner in there and drain it. and that'll clean it out as well. You don't have to worry about getting these areas wet. These things are able to get wet. You can work in the rain. What you don't want is air getting in the engine, and you can pretty easily prevent that by A, not being an idiot, and B, just keeping the saw tilted a little bit this way, and that way, even if some water got into the carburetor and got past the choke butterfly valve and the throttle butterfly valve, it's going to drain back out. And then you let the thing sit in the sun for 30 minutes, depending on where you're at, and you'll be good after that. Okay, good. The next thing you need to understand on any small engine, but especially on chainsaws, is that you have a choke. So here's what a choke is all about. I want you to imagine that you're drinking Coca-Cola from a straw, and someone you know pokes a little hole in that straw above the liquid line of the Coca-Cola. Now, instead of getting pure Coca-Cola, you're going to be getting Coca-Cola and air. And that's what an engine wants. An engine wants fuel and air at a ratio of 15 parts air to 1 part fuel. Well, when the engine is cold meaning I can touch it and I don't get burned, even if it's 90 degrees outside, that's considered a cold engine. We still want 15 parts air to 1 part fuel. The problem is that the fuel tends to stay in liquid form, and it deposits itself on the walls of the intake and of the cylinder and of the carburetor. It doesn't vaporize into gas form like it does when everything's super hot. And so because of that, we need a little bit of extra fuel to get the whole process started. And so what we do is we choke the engine. And when we choke the engine, it's the equivalent of you then taking that finger you have and putting it over the hole that your friend made in the drinking straw so that you get more Coca-Cola and less air. And then within something like 10 to 15 to 30 seconds, depending on what temperature it is outside, you can take your finger off that hole or open the choke, and then you can let more air in and less fuel in and get the whole process started again. Now, some manufacturers have recognized that customers don't really understand the concept of a choke, and instead of calling it choke or not choke, they call it warm start, cold start. And I think that that's a helpful way to look at it, is when you have a cold start where you can touch the machine and it doesn't burn you, even if it's 100 degrees outside, that's still considered a cold start, you need the choke. But a warm start, where the machine is still, let's say, too hot to touch, you then don't need the choke. Because by choking it, you're increasing the amount of fuel that you're getting, decreasing the amount of air, and you're screwing up that ratio. It's equivalent to what we say the engine is running rich. And if you do that for a few too many pulls, then you can flood the engine. And flooding an engine is basically where there's so much liquid fuel in the system that it basically can't get enough air, or the spark plug is now soaking wet, coated with fuel. And if that happens, the electricity can't jump the gap from one side of the spark plug to the other side because the fuel has basically shorted it out, and you have to air out the system or be patient and let it air out on its own. Okay, so that's a little bit about chokes. If you try and choke a warm engine, it will be hard or impossible to start, and you'll have to wait for it to cool down. All right, the next thing you need to understand is your purge bulb. So I like that they call this a purge pump or a purge bulb instead of a primer bulb. On some lawnmowers, you have a primer bulb where every time you push this, you squirt a little bit of fuel into the engine. That is not what this does. This purges the air out of the carburetor and ensures that inside the carburetor is all fuel. Now, you don't actually need to use this, and there are many saws that don't have it because it's just one more thing to leak and one more thing to fail. But what you'll need is a bigger bicep, because you'll have to pull a few more times, because as you pull, you are purging, as you pull the saw, what I mean to start it, you're purging the system of air also. And so this is hardly any calories burnt for your finger, and it sets you up for success, whereas this is a lot of calories burnt on the bicep. But you don't actually need that. You can push it 3 times or 30,000 times. It won't make a difference. Once the air's out, the air's out. And that is different than a primer bulb on a lawnmower, where every time you push it, you squirt fuel into the engine. In those cases, if you push it too many times, you'll flood the engine. Okay, so I think the last thing that you need to know as a chainsaw operator, I'm gonna need to cut here. my 6-year-old was being extremely patient while he waited for me to get done to ask a question. Okay, last thing you need to know about is fuel. So fuel needs to be, you need to think about fuel like you think of fruits and vegetables. You leave them out too long, they go bad. You don't want to eat them anymore. You leave fuel out too long, it goes bad, it doesn't work anymore. And we don't really think of that naturally because we're always getting gas from the gas station, and we're using it in our cars, and we never have to worry about it going bad. But that's because we use it within about a week. In some cases, fuel can go bad in like 6 weeks. And pretty much all fuel nowadays will be bad in a year, most of the time much sooner than that, 6 months. And so to solve that problem, you either need to occasionally use your equipment. I would say every 6 to 8 weeks. It's a great practice to go and start your small engines if you haven't been using them. Let them run for 3, 4, 5 minutes and keep them topped off with fuel, because a large quantity of fuel, or large volume of fuel, I should say, goes stale more slowly than a small quantity. And so instead of leaving your fuel tank empty with all of that air that acts on the fuel and makes it go bad, you want to leave your fuel tanks full, and you want to use them every 6 weeks basically. An alternative to that is storing your equipment completely bone dry, which is sometimes easier said than done. But if you want to do that on a chainsaw, what you can do is you can tip this over and dump it all out, and then you can pull on the starter cord probably 30 times. And every time you pull, you're gonna pull a little bit up the fuel filter, through the fuel line, into the carb, and then it's gonna pull it into the engine. I don't think that's a great solution because it's almost impossible to be sure that you have all the fuel out of everything. And so I think the best solution, although I don't like that it costs extra money, is to buy a product called Stabil, S-T-A-B-I-L. It is a fuel stabilizer, and it's a small amount of chemicals that you add to your gasoline, which preserves it so that your fruits and vegetables don't go bad so quickly. That's what I would recommend for the vast majority of people, unless you're like me and you hate spending money on stuff like that, and you just exercise your equipment every 6 weeks. The last thing you need to know is that you have a fuel filter, which is this guy. You can get them out with a hook tool or a bent hanger or something like that. But at the end of every fuel line, you'll have one of these. And these get dirty, no surprise. And one of the reasons they get dirty is because people don't keep these caps and this area clean. They don't keep their gas can clean, and so they're always getting debris in there. And a chainsaw is a very dirty item. But these can very easily be changed. In this case, you just work it off like that, and you pop a new one on. And Stihl, I don't know about the other manufacturers, but Stihl sells little tune-up kits for all of their chainsaws that basically come with a spark plug, air filter, and fuel filter. You really don't need the spark plug in most cases, but the fuel filters and the air filters are really needed on a regular basis. I would say what you want to do with air filters and fuel filters is when you can no longer adequately clean an air filter, like you can't get rid of the brown staining, it's probably time to replace it. And a fuel filter like this, you can start to see like some discoloration here, very light shading of brown. And it can also start to get a little splotchy. I don't know how well you can or cannot see that. Let me pull you in a little bit. Oh, that didn't work. So what you really want is a consistent, clear, whitish color. And hopefully you can see that there's a little bit of brown here, although that's really not that bad. There are lots of other examples where it's way worse. I'll show you one really quick. If you'll just bear with me. So this would be a really bad example. You can see, and even this, like the machine still ran. It's not stopped up, but you can see all of the deposits that have been left in here. This one, just a little bit, not so bad. And then there's also these kind, which instead of this like solid material, these have like a mesh. And I don't have a bad one of these, but same thing, you're looking for inconsistent coloring and evidence that it's been stopped up. And since they are cheap enough to replace, if you're not sure if you have a good one or a bad one, then I would just replace it. Okay, I think that covers it for chainsaws. those are the things that I think you need to be aware of if you own and use a chainsaw and you don't want to be sending it in for service every year because it won't start. I'm not saying that everyone should be a small engine mechanic, but chainsaws of all of the small engine tools are by far the most dangerous. And if you don't realize how some of these things work, you may inadvertently put yourself in a more dangerous situation. Regardless of safety and danger, nobody wants to take their stuff to a small engine mechanic every year and have it serviced. So I hope these things make it a little bit more clear to you as to how these things work, what sort of things you want to keep clean and lubricated. And basically, a clean saw is a good saw. And aside from the bottom, basically every other area of the saw benefits from being clean in terms of airflow, in terms of heat dissipation, in terms of friction. And so keep your saws clean, cleaner than you think they need to be. After every time you use it, take this cover off, clean under there, take this cover off, clean under there, and make sure your fuel doesn't get older than 6 weeks without exercise or without stabilizer. All right, that was a long video. I hope that was helpful to somebody out there. And if not, let me know by giving me a thumbs down, and I won't make this kind of stuff in the future. And in the meantime, head on over to Steve's Small Engine Saloon or Donnie Boy, the Small Engine Doctor. Both of those guys are pretty good, and I hope you'll enjoy their content. All right, folks, take care.